You kind of teased this conversation last week when we were talking with our boys from First Form about, like Kit said, the supplements aren't necessary if you eat a perfect diet. Well, no person really eats a perfect diet, and no deer really eats a perfect diet either.
Definitely. You think
I'll disagree with that. I mean,
look at it. Look at it.
Yeah, you can tell Mark Freeze has the perfect diet.
Specimen, a mountain of a man.
I've hunted with Mark, and
You've seen the diet?
Oh, it's perfect.
This segment is brought to you by Analogics. Protect your herd with the power of science.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Drury Outdoors 100% Wild podcast, episode number 197, supplementing a successful season. I am Tim Chelsvik.
I'm Matt Drury, and we have the madman, Mark Drury, today.
Hi, guys. How you doing?
Hey, I'm excited because people are going to listen to this show.
Because Mark's with us.
The feedback we always get is the shows with Mark are always great.
No, we just like to put him on other people's podcasts. So their shows do well.
He's booked with working class bow hunter at the moment.
I listened to that podcast, and I heard you guys talking about our podcast.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't all kind, Tim.
I find that hard to believe.
It was all about how Mark likes their podcast better.
Isn't any PR good PR, though?
Yeah.
I mean, in all reality.
I sat there listening to it. I was like, what?
Well, if Mark listened to our show, then maybe he would think differently.
True. So let's just go.
Or maybe not.
Maybe his assessment was correct.
Right.
I've heard the ones that I've been here for.
Not impressed.
Actually, that's a benefit for us because we always say that a lot. Like we talk about you and Terry, it's mostly good.
Glowingly.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's best if you guys just don't know what's happening.
Sure.
I can use all the fart sounds I want on the soundboard.
Speaking of not knowing what's happening, I hope the fire department doesn't find out how many people we have on today's show, because I think we've exceeded the fire code for capacity.
So we got a bunch of guests joining us today.
We got Mark Freeze, we got Tim Newman, and Aaron Gaines, all from Analogics.
What's up, guys?
Not much. So I'm Mark from Analogics. Sometimes I hope this doesn't sound like an AA meeting where I'm Mark. Tim's with me also.
Yep, Tim Newman, wildlife biologist.
And Aaron?
Hi, Dr. Aaron Gaines with Analogics as well.
And for everyone that's listening, Aaron is in like a buck killer's cave of secrecy. It looks ominous and cool, and I'm a little jealous.
Yeah, these bucks are all bucks I've harvested in northeast Missouri, and I think 80% of them or better are archery kills.
Right on.
Unreal. The only thing left to complete the picture is you with a cat in your lap and slowly petting it.
There could be a dog that shows up.
Big lab in his lap.
All right. So, you guys, the title of this was Supplementing a Successful Season.
And I came up with that title.
Yeah, let's make sure everybody knows Tim does work here. Mm-hmm. And so the big thing is, with Analogics, we've been partnering with these guys for quite some time now. And we've talked about it before in the podcast. A lot of people always think summertime, that's a time to get some stuff out. Usually put a bag of, supplement gold or whatever out there. But really, you want to backtrack that, and now's the crucial time. And I've learned this from Mark Drury over the years. Now's the crucial time to really start affecting your deer herd in positive ways. It's not just about the bucks; it's overall herd health. And so we're going to dive into all those things a little bit more today.
And I think it's important to have these guys on so that they can state things that we don't articulate as well as they will, particularly Dr. Gaines. I always want the healthiest herd I can have. And a lot of times you start talking about feeding and people go, oh, they're baiting, right? That's the first thing they say. And that's not it at all. So I'm anxious to dive into this with Aaron and Mark and Tim and really get to why we love Analogics so much and why we believe in it.
Before we do that, I think we failed a little bit already because I don't have on the soundboard anything that's pre-put in here that says I'm a learned doctor, because I would have been hammering that sound as much as possible for Aaron.
We'll handle it in post.
All right, so where do we jump in?
One of the things that I think about when I think about the topic is like, how do you switch your mindset? Because I think a lot of guys will start considering, well, I'll put out a mineral site or something. They think short term, like I just want to bring bucks into a shooting lane or something. But really, again, we're talking next level. We're playing chess kind of scenario.
Well, maybe we should roll back a little bit and start with some of the history of as why Analogics is kind of the leader in the industry because of the science that goes into it. So I don't know if Mark Freeze, if you want to give a quick backstory on the history there before we jump in with Tim and Aaron on some of the facts behind it.
Sure. So I'm going to try and do it in 2 minutes or less. I don't know how successful I'll be at that. The history is it started back in about 1970 with my father. And my father had just gotten out of vet school, went on to be a veterinarian. But as family members, we affectionately found out my father had a different passion in life. And it was laboratories, research, nutrition, and building businesses that complemented the production animal field. So let's fast forward to about 40 years later. So it starts in 70, and now we're up at 2012. We're into what is now our third laboratory. He's had multiple vet clinics and multiple nutrition companies. And we had that infamous EHD break of 2012, which just blew everything up to the forefront. But prior to that, I'll call it the third lab, had really developed the first autogenous vaccine for EHD. At the same time, our laboratory was doing a lot of research on grass products. And for people that don't understand what grass is, it's products that are generally regarded as safe, which have antibiotic properties. So at that time, in that 2010-ish, everyone was trying to go antibiotic free, right? So we wanted to have chickens that were antibiotic free. We wanted to have production animals, whether it was your beef or your pork, everything wanted to be antibiotic free. So we were looking at essential oils and what oils have the same healing properties of antibiotics. So we've now designed the EHD vaccine. We now have what we know of research for grass products, and then EHD hits. And it really wiped out the wild herd. So at that point, we took what we knew of grass products and again, combined it with what we knew of the properties. And I remember sitting there one day and my father, we were noodling it, and he said, I'm going to remind you guys. He said, EHD is not always the killer. Most of the time, it's the secondary pathogens. And he said, if you're strictly going to focus on EHD, you're going to miss your target. And so we'll delve into that a little later because that brings us into what we see in COVID today. COVID isn't necessarily always the killer, but it's the secondary things that when you start stacking the dominoes, the tower can't stand. And so we knew that very early on. So my father's recommendation, or at his recommendation, was to really focus on EHD, but at the same time, be very focused on the secondary pathogens. And Aaron and Tim can talk about that. So at that same time, we also had nutrition companies. So we knew our delivery mechanism had to be something that could be fed. It had to be grassy, generally regarded as safe. So we combined what we knew from our production animal nutrition with the laboratory, with what we knew in the vet clinics, and all of a sudden we built a product. And I remember I was friends with Todd Quinn and Mark. We all know Todd from Muddy Big Game. And I was going over this with him, and he says, "Boy, you really got to talk to Drury's." And I said, "Well, I don't know Drury's." And he says, "Well, I do." And so I remember the first meeting with you guys where we started looking at, we started explaining what we were about. And it was more than just healing properties and grass properties, nutrition. We had at the same time gone in and looked and done liver analysis of wild deer and found out what this wild deer population was really lacking. So we brought all those trace minerals into play. And we can talk about that later also, but that's really who we are. That's where we came from. And now we're in our fourth laboratory. We're in Analogics. And, we always get a bad rap. Are we truly science guys? We kind of are. I mean, that is our roots.
Yeah, legitimately science guys.
Look, we've been there. We've seen all the labs and everything, and it was jaw dropping when we first met him, and it was even more so when we went and visited their facility. And it is such a stark contrast to everything else on the marketplace in terms of the science behind it, and the reasons they do what they do versus everybody else is really focused on attraction,
100%,
and they're focused on herd health, but yet their attraction is greater than anything else I've ever seen on the market as well. Yeah. So it's really the best of both worlds.
I've always said, I've been able to see it firsthand when I run out of the analog, and I'm in a county here in Missouri where I can supplemental feed and do all that stuff. So when I have it out, the trail camera, the amount of pictures I get versus when, say, I run out of it and I can just put a bag of corn out, it's not even the same story, which is crazy. I mean, you always said, oh yeah, throw a bag of corn out.
What could be better than corn?
And it's a totally different story.
Yeah, which goes to that attraction. So they're attracted to it. B, it's really a health component going into that deer system, which I want to introduce or talk to Aaron Gaines about that. Aaron, if you would you take us through Anti-Supplement Gold and kind of, without giving away the secret sauce, tell the average hunter what it does outside of the incredible palatability. What's it doing when it goes in that deer system, and start kind of in the first quarter of the year, which we're in right now, and then take us through the importance of continuing that in through summer and the late months of summer.
Yep. No, sounds good. So I'm going to maybe back up a little bit instead of jumping into supplement gold, and just talk about supplemental feeding and why we do it. We know from, feeding livestock that proper nutrition is critically important for that animal to be able to express its genetic potential. I'm going to reference a couple studies because I always get the question, supplemental feeding can be really expensive, particularly right now, right? We're looking at $5 plus corn and soybean meal that's $450 a ton. And so I always ground myself back to my own experiences and also the research. And there's two studies. One was done at Texas A&M down in South Texas. And in that study, they clearly showed in their research that by supplemental feeding in that environment, they were able to increase body size and antler growth. And the second study that was interesting was a study done at Mississippi State University at the MSU Deer Lab. And in that study, they showed that maternal nutrition, so what the doe eats, has an impact on her offspring. And so that maternal effect, or what they call epigenetics, is very interesting because basically if the doe nutrition is limiting, it's going to downregulate the genes in that offspring, and they're not going to be able to express their full genetic potential. So as we start thinking about supplemental feeding, it has an impact not only on the doe, but also on our offspring, which affects, the overall deer herd. And it's something that's not going to change overnight. We've got to look at the overall nutrition program, whether it's supplemental feeding, whether it's mineral supplementation, whether it's food plots. But two really good studies there. One was a 10-year study. The other one was a multi-generational study, basically over two different parities in that doe's life. And so as we start thinking about supplemental feeding, if the environment is limiting, it's going to affect the quality of the deer herd. So I think that's important as we think about supplemental feeding, because I always get the question, well, it's too expensive to do that. But if you're really, truly trying to improve the quality of your deer herd, supplemental feeding is where it's at. And I think, the DOD team has proof of that over the last 5 years. Just looking at the number of animals and the quality of animals you guys have been able to harvest, I think it speaks to the value of supplemental feeding. I know you guys use the Supplement Gold product as part of your program.
Absolutely.
Now, Aaron, not to jump in here, but that was real interesting that Aaron brought that up, because Aaron and I were talking this morning. I'm in arguably my third generation, my second generation, starting my third generation of offspring since starting this product. And I've told Aaron what I used to have for a 2.5-year-old when I started, that same deer today, a 2.5-year 8-year-old, you can't even compare the two deer. And I don't want to get into inches and all that, but they are definitely a different deer. And it tees into what Aaron just said. It starts with the mother, gets to the offspring, and then you really start seeing it as that next generation comes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the thing I get questioned on a lot of times here in Missouri is, how am I able to get on good deer? Well, there's no secret to it. I'm just providing everything I can to that deer and make sure their environment is not limiting, and put a lot of emphasis on nutrition within the deer herd. I mean, that's really the secret sauce on what I'm doing. I'm just giving them everything they need. So that doe is not limiting when she gives, birth to those fawns. And the supplemental feeding program, back to that Texas study, they showed an improvement in fawn survivability. The fawn to doe ratio was higher. So it really highlights, the benefits of supplemental feeding. And supplemental feeding truly unlocks the genetic potential of your deer herd. And so it's one of those, Matt, Drury, you mentioned earlier, a lot of times we're pretty short-sighted on how we supplement the deer herd. About springtime, we start thinking about mineral supplementation, but, my approach has changed from not only mineral supplementation, but really doing supplemental feeding. Yes, it is expensive, but man, it really pays off. And to Mark Freese's point, it doesn't happen overnight. It's going to take years of feeding to start seeing that herd express its full genetic potential. Because you look at that MSU Deer Lab study, when those does were in an environment where nutrients were limiting, there was a downregulation of those genes for things like body weight and antler growth. But when those does were provided with proper nutrition, those genes are upregulated, and then the offspring of those animals start to express more of their genetic potential. And that just gets better over time as you really improve the environment, in this case, the nutrition of the animals.
That was
so, Aaron, let's take it from that. Let's transition to how are we different? How is our feed different? What do we do to promote what we just talked about?
Yep. So in the case of Supplement Gold, you talked about EHD virus, and that was kind of the impetus to starting Analogics. We certainly focus a lot on how do we address EHD and other diseases in deer through nutrition. And as Mark Freese indicated, the analogy is COVID, right? COVID by itself may not necessarily, cause death, but when there's some type of comorbidity, that's when we're in a real problem. And no different than the deer herd, if there's a secondary pathogen like Fusobacterium or Clostridium or E. coli that's present in that deer, and then they get infected with EHD from the midge fly, then that deer certainly has a poor chance of surviving that disease insult. And so what we do is we put a lot of focus on our functional ingredients. Mark Freese mentioned essential oils, but we also have probiotics in there that are very specific for certain pathogens. And so if we can improve overall gut health, we improve the likelihood of that deer surviving something like EHD virus. But for us to be able to do that, we can't just depend on things like mineral supplementation only. So all the functional ingredients coming from Mineral Dirt 180, because we know on a mineral lick, those deer are not consuming out of that mineral lick every single day, right? They visit it when they need it. In the spring months, certainly when there's nutritional deficiencies in the plants, they seek out minerals more, right? That's why they hit mineral licks harder in the spring, is because the plants are limiting. So that's where supplemental feeding becomes important to ensure that we're getting adequate intakes of those functional ingredients and those nutrients those deer need all year long. And it doesn't matter what we put in the feed. If they don't eat it, it won't matter. And so we put a lot of time and effort, as Mark Drury indicated, on attraction, the power of attraction. I mean, so we've done a lot of different evaluations of different flavorings to try to get those deer to the feed or the minerals so we can increase consumption to make sure we're getting adequate levels of key nutrients and functional ingredients that are going to help that deer and improve overall health.
I imagine this would be a difficult one to measure, but do you guys have any kind of stats on the survivability, the mortality rates of deer that have been supplemented with analogics when EHD is in the environment versus those that aren't?
Tim Newman, you want to take that one?
It's hard to study free range because you don't know the extent of the confounding variables.
Yeah.
And it's also hard to study in a pen scenario because no one wants to introduce EHD to their pen. So there hasn't been really good studies on that. But the anecdotal evidence is from guys like Mark Drury and guys like Lee Lukoski that feed a lot of the product, and their neighbors have issues with EHD and they don't have as much issues. So it's also hard to calculate actual death loss numbers because the DNR doesn't do a good job of counting them all. They just know that there's an outbreak and that it's good, bad, or, not as bad. So they don't get into specifics on something that can be statistically significant versus, in one treatment area versus another. The confounding variables are just too high.
Sure.
From a blue collar viewpoint, like I'm not trying to eliminate EHD. I'm trying to minimize it because I don't think you're going to get rid of it. So, there's so much dispersal within a wild free roaming herd. You're only going to affect the deer that are there at that time. So those that are off your property, you can't help. So we as a group in our area try to feed as much as we can in different areas. Myself, Greg Glessinger, David Lindsay, and we're doing it at the key times of the year to try and help that herd have the best chance they can of fighting AHD if you get an outbreak. So I love everything everybody's talking about overall genetic potential, but in reality, I'm just trying to save my deer herd, and the other benefits are great and they're there and they show. But in reality, my goal isn't to make bigger, better deer because we already have that in Southern Iowa. The dirt's unbelievable. And without anything, you've got giant deer there. I want to make sure that I give them the best chance they can to fight EHD if it hits again, because I've seen it too many times.
Sure.
Multiple outbreaks of EHD over the last 20 years. So that's why I am so hell-bent on feeding and supplemental feeding, not only through the winter, but also right after spring turkey season and on in through the summer to make sure that they have a chance to do the best they can if it hits again. And I personally feel it's going to hit again this year, so I get worried about it. Anytime we're in a La Nina, that you really go through some dry periods in the spring and summer. And in 12, we were in a very strong La Nina. We're back in that La Nina pattern again. So I look for this year to be pretty devastating if what they're predicting actually occurs.
And we know that La Nina is the Nina.
Yeah, we know
Spanish.
that. Thank you.
But it has to do with weather patterns coming out of the Pacific. El Nino, we're generally a little bit wet, a little bit cooler. La Ninas end up putting the weather in the Midwest and through much of the country a little bit drier, a little bit warmer. And that's exactly what happened in 12.
Sure. Now, there are a lot of counties and states that can't do supplemental feeding. Are there solutions for guys that maybe could put out mineral but not feed?
Tim, let's talk about the food plots more.
Yeah, in that case, like Illinois, you're not allowed to supplement the herd at all. So you just got to rely on more of the other pieces of the management puzzle, like your forest management and your food plots, and just trying to increase overall nutrition availability throughout the entire herd and trying to put as much nutrients on the landscape as you can. A lot of guys focus on just the food plots, but they're only spending, an hour a day at a food plot, whereas the rest of the habitat could also be improved. I'll give you a perfect instance. We've got a pro staffer in Mississippi, and he's not in the Delta. If you guys know Mississippi, the Delta is where most of the big deer live in Mississippi. He's outside of the Delta. He's in the south central part of the state, but he grows 190 plus inch deer every year. And he's doing things like fertilizing natural vegetation just to increase the available browse. And anywhere you can add nutrients to the diet of a deer, it's going to help. But obviously through the feed, it's a little bit more efficient.
Could I have his address and phone number when you get a second?
Yeah, it's Austin Ashley. You can look him up on Instagram.
So I'm going to circle back to my question for Aaron. Tell us about Supplement Gold and what it's actually doing to try and keep that herd healthy and minimize EHD deaths when you do have an outbreak.
Yeah, so on the Supplement Gold product, we've got essential oils in that product. They're going to be very specific. They're antibacterial, antiviral. So they've got some very unique properties there, and it's a blend of essential oils. So we're taking kind of a multifaceted approach to pathogen control. Other pieces to supplement gold would be the probiotic technology, and those are very pathogen specific. So going back to trying to eliminate some of the secondary pathogens that are a lot of times associated with EHD virus. So we know in captive deer populations, a lot of times when you do diagnostics or necropsies on those deer that die from EHD, we usually find some secondary pathogen, and Fusobacterium is very commonly found. And so if we can knock down Fusobacterium in the wild deer population, we're going to improve the survivability of our wild deer herd. We talked earlier about attraction and making sure that we optimize that. So we do have some proprietary flavors in there to make sure we maximize consumption of key nutrients and functional ingredients. We do have chelated minerals in there, so that becomes important, not only making sure we meet the animal's requirement, but making sure those minerals are bioavailable to the animal and they can utilize them. Obviously, mineral nutrition is very critical for maintenance functions as well as the immune system. And so kind of bundling all that together, just really pulling together a lot of different technologies that we've leveraged in the livestock industry and applying them to deer feed. And we've done a lot of research with these functional ingredients and these nutrients. Tim and I last year, we set up a captive deer herd in Northeast Missouri to do some further testing of some of these functional ingredients in more of a controlled environment. As you guys know, when we go out to do field evaluations in a wild deer population, those studies are not as controlled. So a captive deer population allows us to do some discovery research that's more under of a controlled environment. So that's been important for our product development and validation of some of our technologies, like Supplement Gold.
Yeah, I remember the first time we met with these guys and they showed us that map of like different mineral properties in the country, different states. And that was the most eye-opening, I think, for you and Terry when you sat there and looked at just how deficient a lot of areas can be and what their product is then putting back into the herd to help that overall health. So that was an eye-opening moment for us back in that first meeting.
Absolutely. And it also showed us where the areas, if you look where all the big deer being killed, you can see that, the deficiencies were less in those areas.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that chart in a while. I'd love to see that again.
Yeah.
B-roll that baby.
Yeah.
They may not
It's very interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting.
We can have Tim send that out to you ahead of time.
Yeah,
right,
that's
we'll
awesome.
Put it up here on the B-roll then for the post production.
Yeah,
you kind of teased this conversation last week when we were talking with our boys from First Form about, like Kit said, the supplements aren't necessary if you eat a perfect diet. Well, no person really eats a perfect diet, and no deer really eats a perfect diet either.
Definitely, you think.
I'll disagree with that. I mean,
look at it. Look at it.
Yeah, you could tell Mark Freeze has the perfect diet.
Specimen, a mountain of a man.
I've hunted with Mark, and
you've seen the diet.
Oh, it's perfect.
So that it was a good easy correlation because it's like, all right, so if you can't get everything you need, what you gotta supplement what you need. You know that a wild herd, there's no way they can get everything they need, especially in their kind of grazing patterns. They're just a little random, and especially if your area doesn't have the things that they need in it, you really have to supplement. So I think it was an easy correlation between humans versus kind of like your COVID correlation. It's, if you have underlying issues, your chances of survival are just a lot worse.
Yeah. So let's say someone's listening to this conversation. They realize, okay, I want to start on this path. I know it's not necessarily going to give me immediate benefits, but I want to start on this path as part of my management plan for my property. What are some of the mistakes that you guys see people make when they initiate a supplemental feeding program?
I see a lot of guys starting a little bit too late as far as getting the nutrients to the deer before the really bad stress periods. Like right now we're hitting kind of the coldest part of our winter. And right now would be not the time that I would want to just put a bunch of feed out that in an area that hadn't been any feed prior to this point, because there's obviously the chance that there could be some problems with digestion, because a lot of the deer, if they haven't been supplementally fed, they could be on more of a browse diet. And if you switch them to a complete grain diet, there's problems with the digestion. But what I would suggest is guys hit it a little bit earlier and try and get it in front of the stress periods so that it's more natural for the deer, and then gradually increase the amounts so that you're really doing the best benefit that you can.
So say there was a guy that just put some out.
Hypothetically.
Yeah, hypothetically. I mean,
He's got a beard.
Where
his name's Matt. He has a podcast.
The browse is less, it's not as good of browse as what is available in Missouri right now. You know, like the type of browse that they're eating in northern Minnesota is just way too high in fiber content compared to what they're eating in Missouri. There's still probably some forbs that they have access to, which is a lot better, easier digesting than what they're doing up farther north.
Well, that's what I thought.
Because their gut bacteria literally changes as the season.
Don't be cautious about feeding in this time of year because of the probiotics that we've put into Supplement Gold. That helps digestive efficiency. If you just put straight corn out and only straight corn, that is even worse, because that is just so much of the energy and the carbohydrates, but without the protein, and the chances for acidosis is so much higher on a just straight corn diet.
We knew that. We were just.
I mean, I have heard that before. That as the season rolls on, their actual digestive system changes with the season based on what's available to them. I've heard that before, but and you kind of even see it in the late season when they start. They're at the edge of the field, they're in the woods, and you're like, what the hell are they eating? It's like they're eating anything. It seems like
they're like goats.
Yeah,
they literally browse on anything.
Yeah.
Really makes another thing on the supplemental feeding piece of it is one of the things that's changed over time as we look at the amount of residual crop that's left in the field after hunting season. The equipment today, there's hardly any residual crop left in the field. And so I think supplemental feeding is more important today than what it has been in the past, of just being able to provide those animals resources during the winter months when food resources are more scarce. So I think that's something that we've learned as well, and some of the benefits of supplemental feeding. And one of the things that we've started to do is more phase feeding. And what that is, that's a principle that we use in livestock, particularly in swine diets, where we try to provide the right amount of nutrients to that animal based on the requirement. And so, like with a lot of supplemental feeding programs that we customize for land managers, we'll feed different levels of protein depending on time of the year to better match up to that animal's requirement for things like protein. So, feeding a 16% protein diet right now in the winter months isn't going to do us a lot of good. So there's going to be excess protein there that animal's got to get rid of. And so we'll feed something closer to a 12% protein, which better matches up to that animal's requirement. Then as we start approaching the spring months, when we start having does fawn and the bucks start to grow their antlers again, we'll increase that protein up because the protein requirement's higher. And so the phase feeding allows us to be more specific to the animal's requirement. And then when we have corn that's $5 plus, or soybean meal that's trading at $450 a ton, we can really lower the cost of those supplemental feeding programs for the land managers that are feeding all year long by not overfeeding nutrients.
Oh, and we had Tim on, I don't know, maybe a year or two ago to talk about the liver analysis that you guys do. If folks didn't hear that, maybe touch on the liver analysis, because that probably has an impact on how what your calculus is in terms of your supplemental feeding.
Yeah. So basically we just take a liver from a harvested animal, and then we do tissue analysis of the micro minerals. And it's basically like a report card of their mineral intake over the previous 6 to 8 weeks. And then we compile that over enough samples that we can see, like, across a vast part of the whitetails range, they're consistently missing these 4 micro minerals. And that's the copper, zinc, selenium, and manganese. And they are micro minerals and they don't need as much of them, but they were not getting enough of them. So the normal people talk about antlers and minerals. They like to talk about calcium and phosphorus, because if you ground up the bone, calcium and phosphorus are the number 1 and 2 ingredients. But what was interesting was that most of the results that we got, none of those deer had deficiencies in calcium and phosphorus. So they were getting enough of that from the environment. It was the micros where they were really deficient. And that's what we've really highlighted in all of our products. So
I'm glad you said harvested, just to clarify that deer needs to be dead in order to take the liver
it
from.
can only be sampled
The
once.
report card sucks for the deer because it's dead.
You failed. Ultimately, you failed. But gosh, I mean, what a whole lot of useful information if you could see what your deer what had optimal amounts of and what it was deficient in.
And you guys have that programs available to anybody, right? You go to your website and you can.
Yeah, you just go to the website, and it's not cheap, but as far as I know, we're the only company that does that. And a lot of that is, it's vet clinics, and actually doing the research. So it's not cheap, but the information that can be gathered from that is absolutely vital to knowing what your specific herd is missing.
I suppose
I'm going to remind everyone that is a pass through for us. We don't make any money on those report cards. We're doing that just to help out.
And I suppose in the long run, it could be cost effective if you're not.
Oh, sure.
If you're avoiding feeding things that the deer don't need and you're dialing in on exactly what your herd does.
It's basically like getting a soil sample.
Exactly.
It's like, all right, what do I need here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll get one of those
Ironically,
done.
that's exactly what it is. And, we have no problem going out and soil and sample every one of our plots and that cross-X. Why aren't we doing a report card for the deer?
Makes sense. I'd like to talk a little bit about and get Tim and Aaron's thoughts on supplemental feeding in terms of feeding in a spot versus feeding in a plot or a larger space. And I always worry about social stress. I don't want my deer getting around each other because naturally they don't like to be around each other at certain times of the year. So I always have a tendency to put it out free choice. So the does, little bucks, everything has a chance to eat at the table, right? Instead of putting it in a spot where, Mark, we've seen down in Texas, when you have a feeder, there's only going to be 2 or 3 that feed there. The big bully bucks get in and nothing else gets the opportunity to go there. Whereas in the Midwest, I want to make sure everybody gets a chance. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'm going to jump in there really quickly, and then I'll turn it over to the Tim and Aaron. But Mark, you're exactly right. In Texas, we have seen, I won't say feeder hog is a bad word, but you could take an extremely mature buck in Texas and they kind of monopolize that feeder. It's theirs. The does don't get in. It's really theirs. Now, what I have found up in Minnesota is I have a spot that I have literally 3 feeders in a span of 200 to 400 yards. And I'm starting to find out that the deer hitting feeder 1 are different than the deer hitting feeder 2. Now, I'm going to preface this with saying the does are does. I don't count them. They could be going between them because I can't tell the difference. But the bucks, by and large, will pick a feeder or 2 and get very consistent in that. But I will have a whole separate set of bucks 200 yards away that I don't get one picture from the number 1 feeder. I get them all on the number 2. And then I have a third feeder somewhere, and I might get a combination. But you really start to find, for me, that I used to just have a couple big feeders, that I found out I'm better off to have multiple feeding sites to minimize the social stressing that you talk about so regularly. Because I'm convinced some of these deer are not allowing the other bucks in. What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a dominance-based eating hierarchy in the whitetail herd, and there's benefits and there's trade-offs between both feeding techniques. The good part about using a feeder is that it's weather resistant. So if you get some sort of a warm front comes through, even this time of year, and you get a freezing rain, that could impact palatability of the feed on the ground in a long area. Whereas the feeder is going to be more watertight and you might have to clean out the ports a little bit, but it's more of a consistent, it's always there. And the deer might be a little bit, fighting over the feed at that single port, but eventually they'll establish their dominance hierarchy and you'll be able to get them feed more consistently. Whereas with the long spread out version, everybody's going to have a plate. As long as you can keep consistently adding to that plate, that's a good way of feeding too.
We do, and then we vary it as to where we put it. Like we'll put some here, and then we go over here and put another line out. And I just want it as close to a natural residue within a crop field, to Aaron's point, as they're used to. Because the deer in the Midwest are used to going out in the field and picking up that residual, which is, as he said, a lot of efficient combines out there. It's not there anymore. So we spread in a lot of different places and keep it as close to what they're used to as possible. Because in my mind, I just don't want them next to each other. I want as little social stress as we can afford them.
We've seen it before where we've tried feeders and it just, the result, what I noticed on the lease was that the does kind of took over.
Certain times of the year they will.
It was amazing. And the bucks would always be in the background and you'd see them show up, but it might be weird nocturnal hours when nothing else was around them. You know what I mean? So then I started, like you, just kind of spreading it out a little bit more and noticed that I had more bucks coming in and kind of taking over, pushing out the does. And so I don't know, maybe it's different from herd to herd too. I have no idea. The only thing that I always worried about was, okay, hey, there's rain coming or there's snow coming. Like, what do I need to do in that regard? I usually put like 3 bags out at a time and maybe 3 different sites. You're talking a couple 100 acres that I'm dealing with there. So, I know for you, it's a much different scale and level of what you're putting out. Do you worry about, and maybe this question for Aaron and Tim, you touched on it slightly there, Tim, but what do you really have to worry about if you're just spreading it out in a line and it's not protected or covered from the elements? Do you need to pay attention to the weather and say, all right, if it's going to rain tomorrow, I should just hold off and wait until.
Oh, absolutely. We do. We look for a dry period and put it out ahead of that dry period. And consumption is so fast. Oftentimes they intake, incredible amounts in a very short period of time. Like, it is not uncommon for us across around 3,000 acres there in Iowa to go through 20 ton in 14 days. But it's not uncommon at all. That's how quickly the consumption is. So we're just careful about when we put it out and we try to make it last as long as we can.
Sure.
So I'll tie into that real quickly, and then I'm going to turn it back to Aaron and Tim both. To go back to your feeder comment, I was complaining with Tim. I know there's some very specific bucks on my property, and I'm not picking them up on cameras. And to Mark, to your point, that line, and that Matt, your point, the does. I feel better now when I see the does at the feeder, and I don't see the bucks, because now I know that I'm feeding the does for the offspring. So that's a big deal to me. So I want them at that feeder. So I'm not as concerned of why am I feeding the does, but I've had to go locate a few bucks to do an inventory lately. And I have gone to exactly what Mark and Matt, you're doing. I've gone to line feeding, and now I've picked them up. But I wasn't picking them up from the feeders running themselves. Now, going fast forward a little bit, when you talk about seasonality and putting this product out, I really want Aaron to tie into mold, because everyone talks about, putting it out. What are your biggest concerns? The molds, if it gets wet. First of all, Tim, we've had people that have said, my product molded, and they literally probably took 8 bags and just built a pile, built a cone. Well, corn's going to mold. We know that. That's not the effective. Mark, and Matt, you're exactly right. Put it in a line. Don't get it so deep that you're going to have molding issues. But Aaron, touch real briefly on mold and aflatoxins and everything that goes along with that, because that's important.
Yeah. So on molds, as we look at our products, one of the things we do put in our products is a mold inhibitor. And we've worked in the lab to understand what that effective level of mold inhibitor is to increase shelf life of the product and also help it withstand the elements. If it does set out in the environment, it does get wet to prevent that mold growth. with mold, you start thinking about some of the molds that occur in crop fields like aflatoxin. A lot of times, we get concerned with mold, and certainly should be, if that mold gets stressed, because when mold gets stressed, that's when it starts to produce a toxin. But just because you have mold present doesn't always mean you have toxins present. But if that mold does get stressed, it's just a defense mechanism that releases those toxins. And then that becomes problematic. And you go back to things like EHD or Fusobacterium or Clostridium. The problem with those mycotoxins is they're immunosuppressive. So if we've got mycotoxins, that's causing that immunosuppression, and it's going to affect that deer's ability to respond to a disease insult. So one of the other things we think about on Supplement Gold and our products is the ingredient selection. So what do you mean by that, Aaron? Dried distiller's grains. That's a byproduct coming out of the ethanol industry, commonly used in livestock feed. One of the downfalls of dry distiller's grains, particularly in crop years where we have a mycotoxin problem, the fermentation process concentrates those mycotoxins by 3x. So let's say, for example, if you had 100 parts per billion of a mycotoxin in corn, in your dry distiller's grain, it's going to be 300 units. And so it super concentrates those toxins. So we're very careful about using dry distiller's grains in our products. We also do mycotoxin screening of our raw ingredients that go into our products to make sure we don't have mycotoxin contamination in the first place. But not to knock other products in the marketplace, but that is a question that you should be asking if you're doing supplemental feeding, is the source of the ingredients. What is that company using in their formulations? Are they using corn that's been screened for mycotoxins? Are they using dry distiller's grains? Because a lot of times they're pretty cheap, but they can come with some other problems, some other baggage, particularly in crop years where we have mycotoxin contamination. So that becomes part of the puzzle as we start thinking about, deer herd health. If we've got something like mycotoxins present, that's another additive stressor that we're adding to that deer herd.
Newman, anything you would add?
No, I think that's a pretty good summation of what, what could happen if mold gets into a pile of feed. But one other thing that could happen on the line feeding is that you get more non-targets consuming feed. So your squirrels, your turkeys, your raccoons and stuff like that, whereas a feeder kind of limits those numbers. Obviously, raccoons are ninjas and they'll get into pretty much any feeder, but that's another thing you can kind of lower, is the amount of non-targets that are getting at the feed.
We've learned Go ahead, Aaron.
Well, if somebody has a feeder that's coon proof, I'm all ears, because that's probably one of the biggest challenges I have with supplemental feeding using feeders is just the non-target species, particularly raccoons. And, I think both methods work. I know, Mark Drury, you guys do a really good job of application and making sure it's out there at all times, as long as the weather permits doing so. But what I see a lot of times, if you're not using feeders, is land managers that just do it one time per month. And the rest of the month, those deer don't have access to feed resources. That's not supplemental feeding. Yeah, it makes you feel good. But if we're going to make sure those animals are not limited in resources, we really need to be out there and have feed in front of those animals at all times as much as possible. And that's where feeders do offer an advantage. But back to this, aggressive behavior on feeders, the Texas study clearly showed aggressive behavior with supplemental feeding on feeders. And so we do have some of those animals that are not eating out of the feeders. So if you've got feeders and you're using them, I can make the argument, and something I've been thinking about on my own farms, maybe I should be doing both. Of all, providing enough feeders to reduce that social stress, but also doing some line feeding for those animals that are, that are not coming to the feeder.
Well, Aaron, I'm going to tell you, I used to be strictly feeder. I added more feeders, and now I bought into Mark's theory that you got to have both. I have to have both. I'm doing both.
But there's good sound reasoning for both, essentially.
Yeah.
There really is. But for us, the other thing I don't like are feeders on the landscape. Just me personally, from an aesthetic standpoint, I don't like driving around every corner and seeing a big giant feeder there. I like the natural, fields and woods and creeks and stuff. I just don't like them. That's just my personal view, but that's just a quirk I have. But I do believe that, line feeding is the best for the way we do it. We do it in the winter, and then we make sure it's all consumed prior to turkey season. And then once turkey's over, then we start again in late May, and then we'll keep them fed all the way through, as long as the law will allow.
Sure.
And in Missouri, I can't do it because I'm in a CWD county, but in Iowa and in Clark and Decatur, I can. So, we're just very careful about when we do it and how we do it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of turkey season, we have a question of the day that's related to turkeys.
All right. So the question of the day is brought to you by Tinsing Packs. No matter where or how you hunt, we have a pack that's right for you and backed by a limited lifetime warranty.
Hi, I'm Steve Porter, and I was curious if you guys had any tactics on hunting henned-up turkeys during turkey season. Thank you for all the podcasts. They're great. Keep up the good work.
He didn't sound like he was being sarcastic either.
I'm going to default to Mark.
Let's.
That's a question you get often, the henned up gobbler. Well, the first tactic I use, if you've got the land and you've got the time, I go try to find another bird and check him another day, because he's not going to stay henned up the entire season. If you're limited on resources and where you can go and you can just hunt that guy, then the best thing you can do is not over push the situation and go in there and blow him out of the country. You really need to employ some patience, and it may take 1 hour. It may take 10 hours. It may take a multiplicity of days to finally get on that bird when he's in the right mood. If you're low on time, then I try to call the hens into my position. Stop calling to the gobbler and start working those hens. If you can get one of them vocal and start charging back on her and challenge her hierarchy in the flock, then you have a chance to bring that entire flock into your position. The last tactic I'll talk about, and it's really an extreme tactic, but I've had good luck on a bird that's henned up. I can't do anything with him. Nothing else is gobbling. If you can roost him with his hens and then go in there and scatter that flock, I've had really good luck calling that bird in the following morning, but it works best when you can scatter them the night before.
Like, how do you do that?
Go into the roost site and just bump them out. And I mean, that's a very extreme tactic. You go in there and they see you and they're going to fly about, 10 different directions. If you're lucky. If they all go the same direction, you probably didn't have much luck, but I've had pretty good luck scattering birds in the spring, just like the theory in the fall. When you scatter the birds, you reflock them. It freaks him out when he loses his hens, when he's been used to having them.
What about decoys? Is there a certain type of decoy setup you would use to try to help in a henned up situation?
Absolutely. That avian, half strut Jake, I have really good luck. If you can get that in a position where that gobbler can see it, that works. Yeah. Also the trophy Tom, if he's out in the field strutting with hens and you can get to where you can visualize with your trophy Tom within 100 yards, you got to get in his face, really, then you're going to have success at bringing him in, especially if he's an old bird. We've killed a pile like that. Wait till they're in the right terrain, sneak around, get in front of them or get close, show them that fan, show them that trophy Tom, and you can kill that bird that's henned up.
Boom. Right on. There you go, Steve. Straight. Right. He showed me. Okay. And let's hop into the wildlife word. It is brought to you by Muddy Outdoors, home of the highest quality products for serious hunters. So it's a multiple choice, guys, and everyone feel free to play along. What's the primary reason coyotes don't breed outside of February and March? Is it A, the other months just aren't as romantic? B, there's not enough calcium for females to lay their eggs? C, females are infertile 10 months out of the year? Or D, none of your business?
We always default to the guests.
So why don't we do this? We have a cameo of my father.
Hi, Wayne.
Oh.
Hey, Wayne.
How are you, sir?
Hi, Mark. I'm wonderful.
Good.
I'm mesmerized by your ability to talk fast.
You have to when you're around your son very often. or you can't get a word in edgewise.
So getting back to Tim, you want to take the coyote question?
Yeah, I'm going to say that they're not receptive 10 months out of the year. That'd be my Yes.
See?
Ding, ding.
I'm assuming Matt's going to go with that answer.
Yes.
Dr.
See, Tim,
Gaines will
that
go
biology degree is already coming into play for you. Good job,
there.
buddy.
Ding, ding, ding. You guys win.
If you'd have been
The laying the eggs was a close second, though.
Yeah. Tim always tries to trick me on these.
I will say that was the easiest one I've ever heard on this show. I felt like it.
Well, last week was kind of I feel bad for last week's question.
He really tried to mess me up last week.
How many eggs does a typical Tom lay during a spring?
He tried to get me, but we caught it. He makes fun of my public school education quite often.
He's kind of a bully about education, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yep. And other things. I like to shove people.
All right. Well, I think we pretty much covered it. And, I know there's a ton of things that you could dig into with this topic, but if anybody has any questions, where can they contact you guys? And, you guys give them some help and guidance on this deal.
We have on our website, there's a contact us, and I'm actually the one that checks all of those. So feel free to contact us at analogics.com, and I'll respond as soon as I can.
Great.
Perfect.
All right. Well, thanks for watching, everyone.
All right. Until next time, peace out.
We're adding new videos every week, so make sure to click that subscribe button and check out all of our amazing content. This episode of DoD TV was brought to you by Bass Pro Shops and Cabela's.